We are going to talk today about the use of tracers in groundwater to understand groundwater flow, and we are going to present one practical example where we applied such tracers in an underground mine to understand the groundwater flow there. This work is presented by myself, Nilson Giger. It was prepared with assistance of the geologist Jonathan Oliveira, and we had a work team from Water Services and also from this company GeoHydros, in the name of Todd Kincaid. It's a well-known name in the karst environment and use of tracers in the US. And we have done this together, Water Services and GeoHydro, at a mine belonging to Nexa Resources in Vazante. So thanks for Nexa for allowing us to present the results of this study. And also at the second round of this study, we were working in conjunction with IPT, Technological Institute of São Paulo. Oh, see, it was not changing here. So a little bit about Water Services. We are a company that is mainly devoted to services in the groundwater area, modeling, contaminated sites, water permits, and environmental data management. We also have one section of products where we commercialize some software packages, as well as some monitoring sensors. And we also provide training, which this webinar is part of. So we provide free webinars, free courses, or online courses, and personalized courses for companies as well. In terms of products, we represent, we have products Hydrogeology Geotechnics. We represent Waterloo Hydrogeologic that has modeling and data management and data interpretation packages for groundwater. We also represent Bentley in the geotechnical area, distributing and providing services and support for programs such as Plaxis and the GINT software from Bentley. In terms of sensors, we represent the line of products Divers from Van Essen Instruments, which can provide sensors for water levels, temperature, and conductivity, as well as offering monitoring solutions including telemetry or Wi-Fi measurements of groundwater levels mainly. So, getting to the topic, uses of tracers in groundwater. Oops, sorry. Let me get back to the presentation. One screen was moving, the other one was not. So actually, there you are. Okay, use of tracers in groundwater. Tracers can help to answer 4 questions. Where does the water go? How long does it take to get there? What happens on the way? And how the surface and groundwater interact. And also it assists in defining hydrogeological properties of the geological environment. So the primary use of tracers is to define hydrogeological properties, groundwater flow, velocity, flow directions, porosity, hydraulic conductivity, and dispersivity. These parameters can be applied in the study of pollution, migration, recharge assessment, and so on. It can be applied to all types of media, including sandstone, gravel, carbonates, igneous rock, fracture, metamorphic. Any substance can be used as a tracer that's introduced naturally, accidentally, or intentionally into the groundwater system. An ideal tracer is the one that moves exactly the same way as the water in which is introduced. It's measurable, even at very low concentrations. It's safe in terms of potability and environmental. It is low cost and of easy analysis, and should not be present in significant concentrations in the background. Type of tracer can be any substance that can be transported into the groundwater. In general, they can be gases, particles, thermal tracers, molecular, radioactive, or dye tracers. Dye tracers, the most common types are rhodamine, pyranine, uranine, photin, and fluorescein. Here's a little summary of the most common dye tracers used. All of them are usually easy detection in the field, but none of them have very low sorption in the media, and some of them are low cost, some of them are not. So some sample, I'm going to provide the reference for this study where it can be found the characteristics of the dye tracers as well as the media applicability. So rhodamine, for example, it's there are two types, WT and B, and they can be used in clay-free sediments, but if it's clay-rich, then usually there are high sorption. None of them are too much recommended. Rhodamine WT is more appropriate than rhodamine B, but still not perfect. And uranine is better than rhodamine in this sense. And for fracture rocks and karst can be all used. So the basic step in dye tracer study is it's in 5 steps. Determine the locations, monitoring locations, collect background samples, the injection of the tracers, monitoring, and analyze the results. For determining monitoring locations, one should map all water springs, and then before selecting what points to monitor. This is the underground mine with different points of collection that we're going to see in a minute. Collect background samples. One can collect background samples in order to understand what you measure after in the discount, the background concentrations. And it depends on the natural concentration. So if it is sparsely, this is wrong here, sparsely populated areas should be 2 rounds, one week in between. For heavily populated or industrial areas, 3 rounds of background sample. Samples can be taken either as water or just put a charcoal, leave it there 1 week, and then analyze the charcoal results. Then the injection of tracers, one can inject as a pulse for a certain period, and then you stop, as a continuous source, or instantaneous, just throw all at once. Tracer monitoring, one can monitor through the collection of water samples. or samples in terms of collecting the water passing through charcoals and being absorbed, the tracers, and then analyzing, extracting this adsorbed material and then analyzing it, or cotton samples, or through a field fluorometer. Field fluorometer can be, for example, this one. It's a brand called Turner, C3 Turner, where in this case it can collect sample or can analyze for 3 types of dyes at once. It has 3 sampling ports, and then you leave it there and program it to take samples every minute or every hour or every day, depending on how long you want to leave it there, and then you get continuous sampling. They are not as precise as if you take water samples and then analyze in a mass spectrometer. So in this case, it's much more accurate, and it's less noisy than the field spectrometer, because all the particles passing through it can be a little bit noise in the signal. But the price you pay is that unless you are there collecting sample every 10 minutes, you have just the isolated points and you have to interpolate in between to get the curve underneath it. In terms of the charcoal, there is a process. First, you wash the charcoal with clean water. Well, you leave it there, and the dye tracer is absorbed in the charcoal. So when you get back the charcoal, you wash it, and then you dry charcoal. You weight the dried charcoal, and then you have to go through a process of elution. So you extract the dye either through ammonia or alcohol, and then you analyze this liquid that was used to elute the charcoal. So it's a more cumbersome project to take the final sample. But the advantage of the charcoal is you leave the charcoal in points where you are not sure whether the tracer is arriving or not, and your budget or time does not allow you to go in every point and take samples everywhere. So you leave the charcoal, and then it says it's either there or it's not there. You have a quantitative result as well, because by doing this process, you know whether the charcoal absorbed twice as more as the other, but it's not as accurate as the water sample. It's much less accurate, actually. It's a good tool to say it arrived there or it did not arrive there. But in terms of quantitative analysis, it's not the ideal tool, but it's very useful. We have done a study in an underground mine to analyze how much of the water coming from a nearby river is here in this area of picture here, is going inside the underground mine, which is in this part here. Because so this mine is located in the northeast part of the state of Minas Gerais, in a city called Vazante. It's a zinc mine, and the zinc mine is located in this area here. It has about 7 kilometers of mine underground, 500 meters below ground. And on this side, there is a major river, a medium-sized river called Rio Santa Catarina. And the question was that over time, more and more water is infiltrating into the mine, and the river is getting drier and drier. In fact, now for a big part of the year, the river totally is dry out, because part of the water is going from the river is going to the mine. At the initial study, there was some questioning how much of the water going into the mine comes directly from the river. And by knowing that, one can understand, is it worth, for example, channeling and impermeabilizing parts of the river? In order, if you do that, are you going to be able to pump less water? Because the mine spends just in electricity over $30 million a year just to pump the water out of the mine. Plus, operationally, it's not easy to operate with the mine always wet and half flooded. And so they want to know how much water was coming directly from the river and where it was the main points of the river losing water. Because if you impermeabilize this section, is it worthwhile spend a few $1 million to channel this section of the river or not? So in order to answer that, we had to do two things. First, a numerical model, because the answer is not simple. To say, even if I determine that 100% of the water is coming from the river, if I channel the river, who guarantees that the water is not going to come from upstream part of the river or keeps going from the porous medium itself or through the fractures? So in this case, you may actually spend a lot of money and not get the results. So we have done this study and complemented by the tracers in order to understand the portion of the river. The idea here of the tracer is, if one releases a known amount of mass here, if no water is lost to the underground, you inject here 50 kilos. You would expect that at this point, you recover over time the same 50 kilos. Not recover, but you see it passing through, because you multiply the flow rate times concentration, and you multiply the curve, you take the area of a curve underneath the concentration versus time. You are able to calculate how much mass is going through. Say that you inject 50 kilos here and you only get 30 kilos. That means 20 kilos is lost. So 40% is lost to the groundwater. Because if there is no tributaries here, so 20% is lost to the groundwater. That does not mean that the 40% goes directly to the mine. You may lose the groundwater and goes this way, for example. In this case, very unlikely, because the mine has a big drawdown cone. So mostly, if it's lost to the groundwater, it ends up going into the mine. So that was the idea. Of course, it's not as linear, because out of the 40% that you don't see it passing through downstream, portion of it is a result of absorption by organic matter, because these tracers are absorbed. So one would have to estimate how much is absorbed and try to do the tests in periods where it's not as rainy, so there are not as much clay particles floating through. So this river is very crystalline in periods of not too much rain. So those are cares that you have to take off. So here's like I said, this mine is located under in a fault zone, and there is a basin here that is a dolomite area, and it is the rocks outside are margo and phyllite. They are impermeable. This is the area where it forms karst environment, and the mine is located right at the fault where there are the formation of these minerals, calamine and willemite, which is in the composition, it's zinc oxide. So they extract zinc. And to get to these veins of minerals, they built a network of galleries along the fault, which is going down and down. And on this side here, it's the river. Now they are lucky to have this black phyllite here, which is kind of a little bit impermeable, so it reduces a little bit the flow into the mine from the river, but it's not enough to hold it. So there is a lot of water going directly from the river into the mine, which they have to keep dry, of course. There are currently more than 90 kilometers by today of galleries underneath, and the water just keeps flowing. The water goes into one gallery, then they make a hole to go from one to another, and then from this one to another, and it keeps going down by gravity up to some reservoirs here, and then finally goes to this pumping station chamber, which by a shaft it's pumped to the top, and then it goes outside the watershed in River Santa Catarina, but a few kilometers away outside the influence of the mine itself. So that's the thing, that's the infiltration here. Water flows through, they have all kinds of karst features there. And in fact, we see water coming from the primary porosity, water coming from fractures, and water coming from karstic features. And here's an example. This one you see from the walls when you are there, not in the picture, but you see it just dripping slowly. Those are the primary porosity coming out. You see water coming through fractures, and then you see here's a waterfall, 1 cubic meter a second. It's a huge volume of water coming here, for example. That when the gallery crosses one of these karst features, then you have these huge volumes of water coming. So here is the first thing we have done a conceptual model of the mine, where here's the mine in this vein here, the river, the impermeable area. The water coming from the mine is actually discharged here once the river flows out of the watershed here. So it's not in this watershed anymore. We built a fee flow model incorporating these geological features. And this fee flow model, we also incorporated the structures, the geological structures, faults, and every time that the gallery cross one of these faults, there is a spike in the flow rate for a few weeks or months, and then it stabilizes, and then mine keeps growing. It maybe cross another one, there is a spike. So there is a natural growth of the pumping rate over the years, but also every time it crosses a structure, there are these spikes. And the mine were represented by some boundary conditions here, the background. We had at the time 123 observation wells to calibrate the model. So we have done some calibration, both in terms of heads, calculated versus observed heads, as well as the calculated flow rates into the mine. So measure versus calibrated versus observed, calculated, as well as the base flow into or out of the Santa Catarina River. And here are the measure versus calibrated flow rates over the years, and we see here it keeps growing naturally as the mine keeps growing. But when it crosses some faults, it has these spikes and then it goes down. And here is the predicted over the years. One of the concern was that if this would be keep growing as the mine grows. And we said, no, at one point it will stabilize because the recharge will be a limiting factor of how much can go into the mine. And this study was, we want to identify the source of water infiltration from the river to the mine, what section of the river the water is mostly coming from, and how much of the river water was entering into the mine. So we injected 3 tracers in different sections of the river, and we did quantitative analysis of the concentration of tracers in the river and also at the mine inside the mine, and also at the mine discharge channel. That all the water coming out, it goes through a channel and then it's discarded outside the watershed. And that was important because if we compare how much mass we lost from the river, how much mass we can see it flowing through out of the mine, we know, okay, so much mass goes to the groundwater, but only so much of this mass actually arrives at the mine. Could be different. And then we have done at 15 sampling points inside the mine where most of the water springs were noticeable in the galleries. They had some points where, as we saw in the pictures, where a lot of water were coming out. So we did quantitative and qualitative measurements at these points to understand if the water going in these points were coming from the river or just on the groundwater itself. So upstreams, we injected uranin. In the middle, we inject rhodamine. And then downstream, we inject the salt, PTSA. So here is uranin, and then here rhodamine, and in this point, we inject salt. And then we measure inside the mine at these points, of course, at depth. So these are different depths, but just the location on the map itself. So some pictures of us injecting uranin in this case. So it comes in powder, and then you mix water, and then you just inject as uniformly as possible along the river, across the river. And rhodamine inject here as well. Of course, you have to tell up front all the population along the river, because they would see all of a sudden this huge green plume going through, and then the red plume, and then they may be worried. So you have to make some visits along the river and show that it's environmentally safe, and they get prepared so it wouldn't come in the newspaper next day that the company was contaminating all the river and so on. And then also some salt. Salt, because it's much cheaper, and we end up actually, after all, we end up injecting the salt inside directly into some sinkholes that we identified underneath or on the sides of the river, because then you could see immediately after a few hours a spike of salt was arriving, showing a direct connection from these sinkholes to the mine or not. Then we sampled the discharge channel. This discharge channel, we left one of the field spectrometer, as well as we measure from time to time some water samples to be more quantitative. But that one we actually left there for 2 months, because even though most of the tracers came out in about 1 week, we identified after a month and a half, we still some traces of tracers. coming out through the sampler. So we want to capture all the mass. So we left it there. In the river, we sample. This is the most downstream part of the river. And that was 3 a.m. We inject like at 9 a.m. 3 a.m. This plume was passing through, the green uranium was passing through. So we were sampling there every hour or so. Every hour, and then when we start to detect every 15 minutes, as well as underground, we also either left some charcoals, as well as from time to time we did rounds of sample in the mine itself. Then we identified, as in some portions, these are different mine levels. So the upper level, 484, and then the lower level, 388 meters above sea level, and 345, 326. So we identified the points where we saw the tracers arriving. So this portion, yeah, we identified uranium, but in here not. So we can identify the points where tracers arrive. These are the fluorometer, and we use this Shimatsu lab spectrometer here for samples, and then we get curves like this. So this one is the river recovered. So we say, okay, this one is how much we recover of uranium, how much we recover of rhodamine, for example. So the area underneath these curves are actually the mass. We multiply the concentration times the area of the concentration times the flow rate. We actually have the mass recover in different points of the river. And then where we recover the points at the mine, same can be done in the channel. So in the channel here, one can see it's very erratic because different masses are arriving at different times. So one gets a karst feature that has a direct connection to the river, it goes immediately, we see the response. But then there are other tracers that gets into minor features or to fractures or even to the porous media. So over time, you see tracers arriving, but at different rates. And also because the mine, it doesn't pump continuously. Sometimes they stop at night where the energy is more expensive, and then they turn on the pumps. So over time, it's a little bit erratic. So you have to capture the whole thing. So how much we recover in the canal, how much we recover off salt itself. So salt, we had these samples, then we have to interpolate the samples to create a curve. And downstream of the river. And basically, by doing all the calculations, how much mass we put, how much mass we recover, we arrived at 44% of the water pumped into the mine comes from the river at the time that we did the study. So that was a huge volume, 44% of they pumped there about 8 cubic meters a second. So it's enough to supply a city of 4 million people. And they pump 44% comes from the river. It's a huge number, but further studies we saw it's not linear. If we would channel the river, what would happen? We would deviate the water from the part upstream of the river. So not By channeling the river doesn't mean that we would stop the 44% of the flow into the mine. It would stop much less actually. And we also identify the preferred flow paths. If we put this on a map, we would identify channels of flow into the mine itself, and then main entry points and main entry points outside the out points from the river and entry points into the mine, where those are the features. So one could see if we would permeabilize different sections, what would happen if we stop these entry points. Here's some recommended literature for those interested. This is kind of the Bible for practical uses of dye tracers in groundwater. Tracers in general, but dye tracers mainly. This is a private company, but they are Tom Haley is a guru in this area, and he has this company Ozark, and he wrote this, can be downloaded on the internet. He wrote this handbook, which is very useful because it has very practical how to do it, not only theory, but actually in order to elute the charcoal, you have to do this procedure. In order to background, what's recommended rate, frequency of background, and so on. And also this book here is very useful as well. So we use that a lot. So those are the two recommended literature, and would like to thank you all for attending.